Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to talk about the research we've been doing in West Wales, in Pembrokeshire, on the origins of Stonehenge as it relates to its bluestones. Before starting, I'd just like to remind everyone that the first volume of Stonehenge for the Ancestors, the main summary of our excavations at Stonehenge and its surroundings, are now published, the first of 4 volumes by Sidestone Press. And behind me, you've got the other 3 that I'm currently working on now. Anyway, just to set the scene chronologically, the period of Stonehenge is basically from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. So it spans the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. And we now recognize a short-lived Copper Age in between. So it was built basically 1,000 years after the arrival of Neolithic farmers into Britain, bringing agriculture with them. It's well known all around the world, and of course the most striking part of the monument is the Sarson Circle and the trilithons. And it does seem perhaps extraordinary that it is only now that we actually know the origin of those Sarson rocks. Sarson's a type of silcrete, or sandstone really, and I've been able to take part in David Nash's project to provenance them, the results of which were published only last year. So we've got a good idea that basically they come, almost all of them, from a place called West Woods, not so very far from the Great Stone Circle at Avebury. But today we're going to be looking at those far more interesting Welsh stones, the bluestones, that come from 160 miles as the crow flies. More likely, we're looking at a distance of maybe 200 miles, whichever route they may have chosen. More about that later. And as I'm sure everybody knows, the bluestones is that they don't constitute a single geological category. It's actually a catch-all term for a variety of different kinds of rocks. And here we've got the main sorts listed. Dolerite divided into spotted and unspotted, rhyolite, another igneous rock, and then various forms of volcanics, which are mainly tuffs. And then we have also a Paleozoic sandstone from West Wales. Now today they're arranged within the Sarson Circle to form a horseshoe in the innermost area and a bluestone circle beyond that. But it seems that they didn't have that arrangement right at the beginning when they first arrived, because it was 500 years before the Sarsons were put up at Stonehenge, in the decades after 3000 BC, according to Bayesian modelling of radiocarbon dates, that we now think that the bluestones were erected. In that earlier stage, there was a bank and a ditch, but also within that a circle of holes known as the Aubrey holes after the antiquarian John Aubrey. And it was William Hawley, the excavator of Stonehenge back in the early 20s, who first observed that these had held small standing stones, which could only be the bluestones. We were able to excavate one of Hawley's Aubrey holes, Aubrey hole 7, in 2008, and our observations confirm his, that there had indeed been an upright and that it would have been a bluestone. We've talked about the origins of the Sarsons, a short distance away, but even 15 miles when you're pulling stones that weigh anything up to 30 tons is quite something in a pre-industrial society. Interestingly, the amount of effort to move the Sarsons to Stonehenge would have been about the same as moving the much smaller bluestones all the way from West Wales. And in each case, we're looking at about 80 stones, 80 Sarsons and probably originally 80 bluestones. And it's here since 2011 that we've been working with geologists Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer to identify the quarries. Their geological expertise has allowed us to pinpoint certain outcrops from which those Stonehenge bluestones derived. And their extraordinary piece of geological fingerprinting, amazing detective work really, has allowed us to focus on particularly two sites. It's one of the rhyolite sources at Craig Rosavellin and the spotted dolerite source at Carn Goedog. Craig Rosavellin, it was possible to identify the exact location where rhyolite debris at Stonehenge could be matched, and that's marked by that red arrow there, where we because fortunately the rhyolite is different all the way around this outcrop, and through Rob's petrological analysis, it was possible to say that that is the location for the debris at Stonehenge, some 1,200 fragments that he's looked at microscopically. And it was here that we found evidence for quarrying in the centuries before 3000 BC, centering on around 3400 BC. Carn Goedog similarly has evidence for quarrying, far more substantial, whereas perhaps only one pillar from Carn Goedog, from Craig Rosavellin, may have made the trip to Stonehenge. A good number of those at Carn Goedog are likely to have gone, and it can be matched with the spotted dolerite at Stonehenge. Here we have a sequence of dates associated with activity that span a longer period, from around 3400 up to as late as 3000 BC. And here are just some of the stone tools. Well, interestingly enough, the main tool that they seem to have used, or at least that have survived, that were not of organic materials, are these stone wedges, because of course the natural pillars, all you have to do is just lever them off, so open up the jointing, and of course wedges, whether of wood or in these cases of stone, would have been the ideal tool to do that. The quarries themselves, and the sources now marked here as red dots, are part of a major landscape of the Neolithic. And we've known this for a long time because, of course, it's got a remarkable concentration in the lower Nevin Valley of these portal dolmens, the most famous of which is Penterivan, of course, but other excavations have revealed that there are Neolithic enclosures, and of course Wainwright and Darville's excavation at Bank the causewayed enclosure very close to the quarry sources has revealed that this was occupied and reused around 3000 BC, although it was constructed some 600 years earlier. We'll come to Winemown in a moment, because that sits in that area of the Preselis, and it is within 3 miles of these identified sources for Stonehenge's bluestones. It's a very unimpressive site. It's on a hillside on the northern ridge of the Preseli Hills, and it consists of just 4 stones, only one of them still standing, though the other 3 originally stood vertically. And you can see them in this picture forming an arc curving away into the distance. We carried out excavations here in 2017 and then in 2018, and we discovered that the 4 stones, and they're marked by the black and red circles, were just a few of the features that left by this monument, and the blue features marked here were were holes, were features of other sorts. We excavated these to discover that the majority of them were actually holes that had held former standing stones. Here's one of them just behind my head here, and you can see that there's an imprint left by the base of a removed standing stone, but the packing stones have been left in place. And we found that this was the case with 6 such features, and we suspect that at least another 2 were also stone holes, but we didn't have time in 2018 to be sure about that. Here's another one of them. This is at 91 down in the bottom area there, and as you can see, it's quite a substantial feature. That particular stone hole produced chips of stone, and this one here likely to have actually come off the stone itself. It is of the unspotted dolerite type that we have at Stonehenge, and we were quite struck by the shape of the stone hole, the imprint, because it's very close to stone 62 at Stonehenge, which happens to be one of these unspotted dolerites. So just possibly that could have been the stone that originally stood there. Looking at the circle itself, it is enormously large. It's the 3rd largest stone circle in Britain. Avebury's easily the biggest at 330 metres, and then the next largest is Stanton Drew at 113 in Somerset. But at 110 metres in diameter, it is otherwise it is quite remarkable. Now, as you can see, one of the interesting features was the discovery that it had an entrance where we had a small mound with a stone hole at number 9, and at number 21 we found another stone hole. Number 9 still had its stone, but no longer in place, left by the side of it, and we could see that from the angle that these stones were set into the ground. So instead of with their wide faces facing into the circle, actually perpendicular in the form of gun sights, we could see that this was an entrance, and interestingly enough, that is towards midsummer sunrise. Quite extraordinary, we have the coincidence that if you overlay the plan of Stonehenge on top of this stone circle, it corresponds exactly to the outer ditch. So the perimeter of Stonehenge just happens to be exactly the same as the perimeter of Wine Mound. And to my knowledge, these are the only 2 Neolithic monuments in Britain that share that diameter. So we have enough intriguing information to suggest that this may be the origin of Stonehenge. And I should mention that our combined radiocarbon dates and optically stimulated luminescence dates, that's where you measure the energy remnant in grains of quartz within the fills of the stone hulls. We were able to see that the likely date of construction of Wine Mound was around 3400 BC. We can't be sure about dating when the stones were removed because, of course, those were voids, so there's nothing actually to date. All you can date is the sediments that subsequently filled up into those voids, which could be considerably later. We know that the stones were removed before the Bronze Age, before 2000 BC, but we do have one radiocarbon date from one of the void fills at just before 3000 BC. And then the big question, how on earth did they do it? And going back to the 1950s, the time of Richard Atkinson's investigations at Stonehenge, he was very much of the idea that they had taken the stones down to Milford Haven from Preseli and shipped them by sea through the Bristol Channel and thence overland to Stonehenge. My view is that this is actually less likely because, of course, we have the quarries and the Circle of Winemown actually on the north side of the Preseli Hills. So you'd have to really start by going over the top of the mountain before you even really began that route. The other interesting aspect is that Bevins and Ixer and colleagues have now pinpointed Stonehenge's altar stone to an origin somewhere in the area between Crickhowell and Abergavenny, as marked in red here. So my guess is that it's very likely that that was taken along with the bluestones on a largely landward route. That's the mechanics of it, but why on earth should they do it? It's an extraordinary thing to have done. It's unparalleled in British or European prehistory. And we've got a number of possible theories. Is it an act of conquest? Is it a migration, an act of unification? Archaeologists have long wondered whether there might be a grain of truth in the story by Geoffrey of Monmouth, his History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century, when he wrote that the purpose of Stonehenge was to memorialize the British dead massacred by Saxons, and that Merlin had instructed men to go to Ireland, to Mount Kilorus, where there was a stone circle built by giants, known as the Giants' Dance, Chorea Gigantum for those Latin speakers amongst you, people who have a bit of Latin. And Geoffrey recounts in great detail about how Merlin sent an army of 15,000 men to defeat the Irish and to bring the stones back. Of course, Pembrokeshire is not in Ireland, though we know that it certainly had Irish connections shortly before Geoffrey's time. Is there a grain of truth? It's a very long time for an oral tradition to have survived from 3000 BC until the 12th century AD. So I'm skeptical, but you just never know. But I think we've got some interesting information from Stonehenge itself to suggest that maybe it wasn't taken as plunder, that the stones were actually moved by people from the region, so that maybe they were actually migrating out of there. And if we think about those stones as having had enormous symbolic significance for them, ancestral emblems of their very identity, maybe that's a better way of looking at what it was that galvanized them to do this extraordinary thing. And the evidence comes from a recent paper we published a couple of years ago on strontium isotope analysis of 25 of the individuals cremated at Stonehenge, because as everybody knows, Stonehenge is the largest cemetery that we have from the 3rd millennium BC. And what we discovered was that 4 out of those 25, so somewhere around 16% of that sample, had isotope values that were consistent with having lived in the last 10 years of their lives in that region of West Wales. And what's really interesting about the radiocarbon dates on those bones is that they date to the very beginning of that cemetery. In other words, these are, if not the earliest, they are among the very earliest people to be buried at Stonehenge, arriving there at Stonehenge stage 1, when we think the bluestones also arrived. So I think it's very likely that these stones were brought by people from Pembrokeshire to Stonehenge, quite possibly as a migration. So claims for restitution from Welsh nationalists, I'm afraid, at the moment don't have a lot of traction for asking for the bluestones back from English heritage. Never mind. We'll end it there. Thank you very much for listening.